For things are landing in this case at the exact same time tonight, and every single one of them changes something about how we have to understand what happened to Nolan Wells. The FBI has put its role in this investigation on the record, not a leaked line to a reporter, not a comment shouted across a parking lot outside a courthouse. A full written statement from a federal field office on paper with the Bureau's own name attached to it. The young woman at the center of this case's biggest unresolved contradiction has broken her silence, not through a cousin's Facebook post, not through a family friend repeating what she heard third hand at a kitchen table, face to face, in the same room, sitting across from Nolan's own mother. New audio and new GPS data have surfaced that let us reconstruct, almost minute by minute, what that boat was actually doing on the afternoon of July 4th, where it was, when it moved, and how long it sat still.
Wait, you telling me there's a member in Katie's family who is allegedly on the run right now, and that person could be the person that did something to Nolan Wells? This person was seen on a boat with Nolan and has deactivated Facebook and all their social media all of a sudden. Watch this whole video because this is crazy. You telling me Katie family? So everybody knows that the story goes that Nolan left his friends to go say he was going to stay with Katie, but then Katie said he went back with his friends. Now stay with me because it get crazy. Now y'all remember this picture and everybody was saying, was this Nolan? But check this out. Here's a better picture. This person right here is allegedly Katie's dad. Same person as you can see here, and this is Katie's profile picture. Now follow me. Now remember, this is Lil Daddy boat. Now there was an altercation that happened, they're saying at 5 p.m. on Lil Daddy's boat. And what they're saying, here it is, one of my passengers pretty certain he was part of the group, he being Nolan, that was fighting around 5 p.m. This is the first possible lead that we have that says Nolan around 5 p.m. was still there. Now, could Katie's father have been mad that he was with a black girl or that his daughter was with a black man and did something? I don't know, but it's sounding crazy and I don't like it. What if I told you?
And somewhere underneath all of it, a family connected to this case has become the target of threats serious enough that federal resources are now involved in trying to stop them. For threads, one night, and underneath every single one of them, a mother who still, tonight, does not have an official cause of death for her son. This is a Nolan Wells update. Before we open the file, I want to be completely straight with you about how we're going to handle everything you're about to hear, because this case has already been damaged once by people repeating things that turn out to be false. A photo that wasn't from the day people said it was. A video where the voice wasn't who people said it was. We are not doing that tonight. Every single claim in this video is going to come with a label attached to it. This is confirmed. This is what a specific witness said. This is still unresolved. If you've been burned by another channel's version of this story before, stick with us for the next stretch, because we are about to give you the version of this case that's actually built to survive contact with the facts once they finally come in.
Jackson County, Mississippi, the investigation continues into the disappearance and death of 18-year-old Nolan Wells, whose body was found on Monday. Tonight, a peaceful protest was held in hopes for more transparency in that case. Photojournalist Patrick Wright takes us to Ocean Springs.
The goal of today's protest, I feel like, would be just to say his name.
Yes, sir, Nolan Wells.
For me, this means a whole lot because I have my kids in this community too.
Hey, Nolan Wells.
I'm a mom, I have 2 sons, so it hit home for me.
Nolan Wells could have easily been my grandson.
Yes, sir, Nolan.
I feel like today's testament is that we want answers. It's not about vengeance, it's not about accusations, it's about the truth and it's about transparency.
We're going to stand behind the family, and that's why we're out here.
No peace.
A lot of times, these stories go unnoticed.
Because Nolan Wells is not the only one. There has been a long historic string of young black men losing their life under very suspicious circumstances.
I am the family of Emmett Till. And my family is here in support of what's going on because this young man should not be dead.
No justice, no peace.
So I know him personally as a kid before he went out to college. It's hard in this generation to find kids that still say yes sir, no sir.
Nolan Wells!
And when he came to me and wanted to work, he said, you know, my mom and dad told me I got to get my own money. And I said, but when you go out to college, I want you to make good choices and decisions to set you up for a lifetime. And he said, yes, sir. That says a lot about his home life. It says a lot about his parents, and it says a lot about him. The things that he did while he was here on earth, it left a statement and a place in a lot of people's heart. Life is precious, no matter what color you are.
That's a fact.
We just need to get to the facts of what really happened. That's really what it's about, the facts. It's not about the color of the skin, it's about sticking to the facts of whatever it is. And if it's something that happened as a mistake, then just let's speak about it. Let's talk about it. That's it. I'd just like to say to him and his soul, man, rest in peace, and we always love you, man. And you did everything you could while you was here, and you did a great job. And that's it.
If this is the first time you're sitting down with the Nolan Wells case, you are genuinely not behind. We built this update so that a brand new viewer and someone who's followed every twist of the story for 3 weeks straight can both walk away from it with the same clear picture. We're going to walk through this from the very beginning, in order, so that by the time we get to the end, you understand this case better than almost anyone talking about it online right now, including a lot of people who've been covering it far longer than we have. And if you've been with us through the last several updates already, you know the drill by now. Drop the word file in the comments the second you see this video pop up, so we know exactly how many of you have been riding with this case from the start. That number matters more than you'd think. It tells us whether to keep pushing daily coverage on this one, or to slow down and consolidate into weekly deep dives. Either way, it genuinely helps us plan what comes next. Here's something I'd rather just say plainly than dance around. Right now, this channel has considerably more people watching these videos than people who've actually subscribed to see the next one. That means a lot of you are finding this update through search, through a share in a group chat, through the algorithm dropping it into your feed at just the right moment, and then leaving without ever telling YouTube you want to see what happens when this case moves again. If that's you tonight, all we're asking is one tap. Join the community. Hit subscribe. It costs you absolutely nothing. And it means the next time there's a real, confirmed development in this case, it actually reaches you instead of getting swallowed by the algorithm. Thank you for that. Sincerely. All right, let's open the file. Before we get into the FBI statement, before we get into Katie, before we get into any of tonight's actual developments, I want to spend real time on something that a lot of coverage of this case skips past far too quickly. Who Nolan Xavier Wells actually was, before he became a name attached to a grand jury referral, before he became a case file sitting on somebody's desk in Jackson County, before any of it. Nolan grew up in Ocean Springs, Mississippi. He was one of 6 children raised by Christine and Elmore Wansley, alongside his siblings. In that household, football was a side interest picked up because there was nothing better to do on a Friday night. It was close to a family language, something everybody in that house spoke fluently whether they ever put on a helmet or not. At Ocean Springs High School, Nolan was a multi-sport athlete, but football is where he genuinely stood out. His coach later said Nolan carried himself with humility, that he led by example rather than by volume, and that his teammates followed his actions far more than they ever followed anything he said out loud in a huddle. His principal remembered him the exact same way. One of the kindest, hardest-working students to ever come through that building. The kind of kid teachers and classmates gravitated toward without anyone ever having to ask them to. Christine has told one particular story publicly more than once, because it seems to capture something true and permanent about who her son actually was underneath the highlight reel and the recruiting profile. In a math class, there was a special needs student sitting in the room. Whenever the teacher asked a question, most students would shoot their hands up instantly, racing each other to answer first. Nolan noticed that this one classmate needed a beat longer to get there, so quietly, without ever turning it into a performance for anyone watching, he got the rest of the class to put their hands down and simply wait. When she finally answered correctly on her own, he was the one leading the celebration, not because a camera was on him, because he meant it. Her teacher was moved enough by what she watched play out in real time that she emailed the family afterward unprompted, just to make sure they knew about it. You have to be careful when you have a heart that big. Christine has said publicly, because it's not always returned that way, but he was genuinely a good person. All the best parts of me are with him. Elmore has described his son as a silent leader, someone who wanted to show rather than tell, who understood instinctively that people follow that kind of quiet example far more than they follow a speech. He's talked about how Nolan's younger siblings looked up to him without reservation, and how much he'd been looking forward to an entire summer of watching his own boys push each other the way he once pushed his own teammates through 2-a-days in the Mississippi heat. After high school, Nolan enrolled at Southwest Mississippi Community College, roughly 2 hours inland from home, where he walked on as a freshman wide receiver. Number 16, 6'1", 185 pounds, majoring in general business. He just wrapped his first year on campus and was due back for summer training camp on Monday, July 6th, to begin preparing for his first full season as part of that program. That date matters more than it might seem at first. It tells you exactly what this 4th of July trip was actually supposed to be, not some open-ended, anything-goes summer blowout with no end in sight, a short, ordinary break, squeezed in right before the real work of the season started up again in earnest. His coaches at Southwest have remembered him as the kind of teammate who made everyone around him feel like they genuinely belonged on that roster, someone who, even after a season opener where he didn't see a single meaningful snap, celebrated the teams when like he'd scored the touchdown himself. Independence Day fell on a Saturday that year. Nolan spent it the way the same circle of friends had spent it before more than once, without a single incident worth mentioning. A boat trip out to Horn Island. It's worth actually understanding what Horn Island is, because the geography of this case shapes almost everything that happened afterward. Horn Island itself is a federally protected barrier island, part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore, sitting roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi coast, out in open water. There's no development out there, no roads, no stores, no restrooms, no lifeguard towers, no year-round law enforcement presence of any kind. You can only reach it by private or charter boat. It's known for untouched white sand and total, isolated quiet, except on a summer holiday weekend, when it is anything but quiet. Multiple witnesses have described hundreds of young people scattered across that stretch of beach on July 4th, boats anchored in clusters just offshore, music carrying across the water. It's the kind of scene that plays out on that exact stretch of coastline every single year on that exact holiday. And on its face, that particular afternoon, nothing about it looked unusual at all. That is the young man at the center of this entire story. Not a headline, not a case number. An 18-year-old who once quieted an entire classroom so a struggling classmate could have her moment without an audience. A kid 2 days from training camp. Someone who went out on the water with friends he'd made this exact same trip with before more than once, and had always come home with every single time until this one. Now let's talk about what's actually new tonight, and why it matters. 4 weeks now. The question of exactly why the FBI was involved in this case had only ever been answered in fragments. A line here, a brief comment there. This week, the Bureau's Jackson Field office released a complete, formal public statement, and it deserves to be heard in full rather than compressed down into a single headline, because the details inside it matter. The statement says that while the FBI has assisted with certain aspects of the investigation, using federal tools and partnerships that have proven valuable, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office is leading and will continue to lead this investigation. It describes a working relationship between Jackson County and the Bureau built over years of collaborating on complex cases together. It says the FBI has been supporting Jackson County from day one in the effort to gather information and find answers for the Wells family and for the broader community around them. And it closes by saying the Bureau remains ready to assist further, particularly in areas where federal resources might expand what local investigators can accomplish on their own, in the hope of bringing some genuine clarity and peace of mind to the people who love Nolan. It's worth sitting with the actual tone of that statement for a moment, because tone matters here almost as much as the raw content does. This is not a press release announcing a breakthrough. It doesn't read like an escalation of any kind. It reads almost like a reassurance, careful, measured, clearly written to lower the temperature around a question that had been generating real, visible anxiety for days across social media. Whoever drafted that statement at the field office level clearly understood something important. Unexplained federal involvement in a case this visible does far more to fuel speculation than plain, ordinary silence ever could. So instead of letting rumor keep filling that vacuum indefinitely, they chose to fill it themselves, in writing on the record, with their name attached to every word of it. That matters because, up until now, a huge amount of speculation had already rushed in to occupy the space where an actual, official answer should have been sitting. Some of it treated FBI involvement as proof that the case had quietly been escalated into something far more serious than anyone had said publicly. Some of it treated the Bureau's mere presence as evidence of the exact opposite, a cover-up already in progress. Federal agents supposedly stepping in behind the scenes to manage the story rather than actually investigate it. This statement doesn't support either read. It confirms real, meaningful federal involvement. Tools, partnerships, genuine expertise, all of it real, while explicitly stating in plain language that Jackson County remains a lead agency from start to finish. It's support, not command. That's a distinction worth holding on to every single time this case comes up again going forward, because it's going to keep maturing. If you assume the FBI had quietly taken this case over entirely behind closed doors, drop a W in the comments below. If you assume the opposite, that federal involvement somehow meant something was being buried or slow-walked, drop no way instead. I genuinely want to see where this comment section actually lands on that question, because based on the messages we've gotten after every one of these updates, most people watching this case have been sitting somewhere firmly in one of those two camps, without a whole lot of room left in between. Buried inside that same statement is the actual, specific reason federal resources got pulled into this case in the first place, and it's a detail we're slowing down for. The FBI says its efforts are specifically focused on interstate threats received by individuals connected to this matter, and that this work is running entirely in parallel with the family's own independent investigation, not merged into it in any way. That is the clearest, most official confirmation yet of something we've only been able to touch on in earlier updates without full certainty. Federal involvement here isn't about Nolan's death directly. It's about protecting the people connected to this story from threats serious enough to cross state lines and become a federal matter entirely in their own right. Let's actually unpack that phrase for a second, because it's doing a lot of quiet work in that sentence. For a threat to become a federal matter simply by virtue of crossing state lines, it typically means someone sitting in one state sends something threatening to someone sitting in another state, using a message, a phone call, a piece of mail, some channel that inherently crosses jurisdictional boundaries by its very nature. The internet, obviously, is the biggest and most common example of exactly that kind of channel. That is precisely the category of thing the FBI is built and staffed to handle, regardless of how large or small the underlying case itself actually is. It doesn't require Nolan's death to be classified as a federal matter at all. It only requires that somebody, somewhere, use an interstate channel to threaten somebody else connected to the story. Here's what's just as important, and what a lot of the loudest coverage online has completely glossed over in a rush to get a reaction video out first. The FBI statement does not specify what those threats actually said, word for word, or exactly who received them. Reporting on this same statement has noted plainly, from multiple outlets, that it remains unclear precisely what kind of threats were made, or exactly who was on the receiving end of them. That gap matters, because separate, unofficial reporting has already circulated far more specific claims about threats sent to at least one family connected to this case, a family tied to one of the young men who was on that boat with Nolan that day. Those specific details have not been confirmed through any official statement, not from the FBI, not from Jackson County, not from anyone with the actual authority to verify them one way or the other. I want to be genuinely precise about that distinction, because blurring it together is exactly how misinformation continues to spread inside a case like this one. We know, officially on the record, that interstate threats occurred, and that federal resources are currently addressing them. We do not have official confirmation of the specific content of any individual threat, or exactly who received it. Both of those two things are simultaneously true, and they need to stay carefully separated in your own head as you follow this case going forward. There's a real, practical reason official statements tend to stay deliberately vague on exactly this kind of detail, even when the underlying facts themselves are serious and completely real. Naming specific victims publicly or repeating specific threatening language for shock value can itself cause additional real-world harm, drawing even more attention to the exact people the investigation is trying to protect, and potentially compromising whatever legal action might eventually follow against whoever actually sent those threats. That restraint, even when it leaves a watching public with less dramatic detail than some people clearly want, is very often a deliberate, protective choice, not an attempt to minimize what actually happened to real people. What we can say plainly, without a single caveat attached, is this: whoever is sending threats to anyone connected to this case, regardless of what they personally believe happened to Nolan on that beach, is committing a serious federal crime. Full stop. Grief does not grant that permission. Suspicion does not grant that permission. Public pressure, no matter how justified the underlying anger might feel, does not grant that permission either. Nolan's friend Tristan Shepard has said publicly, in his own words, that he and others in his friend group have been receiving threats online ever since this case drew national attention, and that he and his friends did nothing wrong and genuinely don't understand hostility now being aimed directly at them. Jackson County Chancery Judge Ashley Cole, the stepmother of one of the young men who was on the boat with Nolan that day, has said on Facebook that she and her own family have received an outright wave of death threats since the story went national. Those are real, named people describing real, specific, lived experiences in their own words, under their own names. But the exact content of any individual threat, beyond what these people have chosen to share publicly on their own terms, hasn't been independently confirmed by any official source. The responsible thing to do is treat what they've said as credible, because it's coming directly from the people it actually happened to, without treating every second-hand detail floating around online as settled fact, and without repeating the most graphic language just because it's already circulating somewhere on social media. Passing along the worst possible version of a threat, in full in detail, serves absolutely no purpose except giving that threat even more reach than it already had. There's a broader effect worth naming clearly here, too, because it goes beyond just these specific individuals. Every witness in this story, every friend, every family member, every young person who happened to be anywhere near that boat on July 4th is watching all this unfold in real time, in public, with their own name potentially sitting right in the crosshairs of strangers' anger. If simply being named in connection with this case carries the very real risk of threats serious enough to draw actual federal attention, that creates a genuine, measurable chilling effect on anyone else who might otherwise have been willing to come forward with information that could actually move this investigation forward toward an answer. Protecting people from that kind of retaliation isn't just basic human decency. It is directly, practically connected to whether investigators can ever get the full, honest cooperation this case genuinely needs in order to actually reach a real conclusion. And I want to be equally direct about something else here, because it applies to every single name in this case, on every side of it, without one single exception. In the middle of an active investigation into her own child's death, artificial intelligence-generated fake videos depicting Christine Wansley herself have reportedly been circulating online. Fabricated footage of a grieving mother, built entirely with AI, spreading while she is simultaneously planning her 18-year-old son's funeral, sitting through press conference after press conference in front of national cameras, and fighting for a police report she is legally entitled to under Mississippi state law. Attorney Ben Crump's message on this specific point has been simple, and it's genuinely worth carrying with you through the rest of this video. Nobody's life should be threatened in the pursuit of the truth. Nobody should be presumed guilty of anything before actual evidence exists to support it. This case has already produced real, documented harm to real, living people, and the people it hurts most, in the meantime, while everyone waits for actual answers, are the ones who are already hurting the most of anyone involved. Now here's a development that changes the actual shape of this case more than almost anything else that's happened this week. Katie, the young woman Nolan spoke with in his final confirmed minutes on that beach, has finally been heard from directly, not through a relative's Facebook post, not through a family friend relaying secondhand information over the phone, through an actual, real, in-person meeting with Nolan's own mother. According to Christine, she and Katie sat down together, face-to-face, in the same room, and Christine has said plainly, without hedging, that what Katie told her does not match every version of events that's been circulating publicly for weeks now. That alone represents a real shift from where this case stood even a single week ago. Up until now, every single thing attributed to Katie had arrived through intermediaries. First through a family friend relaying what she'd heard secondhand, then through Katie's own mother and sister, posting on Facebook specifically to correct rumors that had already spiraled completely out of control online by that point. Each of those versions was filtered, understandably and probably with good intentions, through someone else's memory of what Katie had actually said, rather than coming from a direct, unfiltered conversation with the one single person who genuinely has first-hand knowledge of Nolan's final confirmed words. A face-to-face meeting between Katie and Christine changes all of that entirely. As far as we know,
two stories unfolding here. One is the mystery of what happened to him, and the other is that it has surfaced in the American consciousness, especially among Black Americans, some familiar anxieties. It really is a story of the unhealed history and lived pattern recognition in Black America. There is the lived history of the South. You know, you can't think about these stories without thinking about Emmett Till. You can't think about these stories without, thinking about the things that our parents taught us, that we have taught our children, even in the most integrated communities. You can't do what your white friends do. We don't have to know yet what fully happened to understand why Black families are reacting to a Black teenager who went out with a group of white friends on July 4th and never came home.
this is the very first time information about that conversation has traveled directly from the person who actually lived it to the person who needs to understand it most in this entire world, without anyone else standing in between the two of them. This is worth walking through slowly and carefully, because Katie's actual account, as relayed by Christine, is genuinely more specific and more limited than a lot of the public conversation around it has suggested. According to Christine, Katie has been consistent from the very beginning of this. She and Nolan met that day on the island, spent time together, and eventually parted ways as the afternoon wore on. Katie then got back on a boat with her own group of friends, entirely separate from Nolan's own group. She assumed, based on their conversation together, that Nolan was heading back to rejoin his own friend's boat before everyone left the island. Here is the single detail that matters more than any other in this entire exchange. Katie never actually saw Nolan get on that boat with her own two eyes. She assumed it, based entirely on what he told her directly in conversation, but she did not personally witness him physically rejoining his friends before she herself left the island. If you caught that exact distinction the very first time this story broke weeks ago, drop the word assumed in the comments below, because a huge amount of the coverage at the time completely flattened right past in the rush to find a clean, dramatic contradiction. That distinction is genuinely, meaningfully important, and here's precisely why. It means Katie's account is not a direct eyewitness contradiction of the friend group story, in the sense of her having personally seen one specific thing happen, while they claim a different specific thing happened. It's something closer to this instead. Nolan told her his stated intention. Whether he actually followed through on that intention before whatever happened next in those final minutes is something nobody currently can confirm firsthand. Not Katie, not the friends who were physically with him, not the family. Both an honest assumption based on a genuine, real conversation and a claim that he chose to stay behind. Can technically both be true at different moments in time, if something changed in the gap between that specific conversation ending and whatever actually came after it. I think it's genuinely worth sitting with why this important nuance got flattened so quickly across so much of the public coverage of this case in those early days. A clean, direct contradiction. One witness says this happened. Another witness says the exact opposite happened. Makes for a far more compelling, shareable, clickable story than an account built carefully around an honest, reasonable assumption. But Katie's actual position, as relayed faithfully by Christine, is far more measured and careful than that dramatic version suggests. She isn't claiming she personally watched Nolan walk away from her and physically climb aboard a boat. She's saying he told her his plan directly, and she had every reasonable expectation at the time to believe he would actually follow through on it. That is a meaningfully different kind of testimony than a direct eyewitness account of an actual physical event, and it deserves to be treated with exactly that level of care, rather than being collapsed down into the exact same category as a flat, contradictory claim from a different witness entirely. This also reframes, at least somewhat, what actually still needs to be explained in this case going forward. If Katie's account holds up exactly as described here, the real mystery isn't actually whether Nolan wanted to leave that stretch of beach that afternoon. It's what happened during the gap between him stating that intention out loud to another person and whatever actually came next in his final hours. That specific gap, as of tonight, nobody on any side of the story has been able to fully account for. Not the friend group, not Katie herself, not investigators working the official case, not Nolan's own grieving family, who want an answer to this more than anyone else alive. Before we move into tonight's audio and the full GPS reconstruction of that afternoon, I want to pause here for just a second and be direct with you. If this is the kind of case coverage you've genuinely been looking for, the kind that actually separates a rumor from a confirmed fact instead of quietly blending the two together just to chase views, the way you help us keep doing exactly that is simple. Right now, this channel's view count is running well ahead of its subscriber count, which tells us that a lot of you watching this exact sentence right now haven't actually told YouTube you want the next one yet. So if you made it this far into tonight's breakdown, do us a genuine solid. Tap that subscribe button and turn notifications on while you're at it. It costs you nothing at all. It means the next real update on this case, not a rumor, not a repost, an actual confirmed development, lands directly in front of you the moment it exists instead of getting buried under everything else in your feed. Thank you for that, genuinely. Now let's get back into it. Separate from Katie entirely, there's another person whose account has grown steadily more important with each passing week of this case. Nolan's friend Tristan Shepard. Shepard has been one of the very few people in this entire friend group willing to put his actual name and his own face to a public correction, even knowing full well what that correction would likely cost him personally. The single most circulated piece of evidence in this entire case has been a short video, filmed from a boat, panning across the open water toward a crowded stretch of Horn Island. Somewhere in that footage, a voice can be heard demanding a phone back. Something close to, "Give me my freaking phone. What are you freaking doing?" Attorney Ben Crump told multiple national outlets in the earliest days of this case that his team believed that specific voice belonged to Nolan. For a large portion of the public watching the story unfold online in real time, that claim was treated almost instantly as fully confirmed fact. It became one of the single most repeated, most dissected, most emotionally loaded details of this entire case. It has since been directly and publicly disputed by name on the record by the person who actually claims to be on that recording. Shepard came forward publicly to ABC News and said the voice on that video is his own, from an entirely separate, unrelated altercation with a completely different person that same day, and that Nolan isn't even shown in the footage at all. He's described being physically calmed down and helped off a boat during that unrelated altercation, and said Nolan was somewhere nearby in the water, out of frame entirely, at the exact moment that video was recorded. At a later press conference, a reporter pressed Crump directly on whether that specific quote could actually be confirmed as Nolan's voice or not. His answer, notably, was far more careful than it had been earlier in the case. The original claim, he said plainly, came from a single witness. Since then, another witness has come forward directly disputing it. Other witnesses have described entirely separate altercations happening on that beach that same day, unrelated to either version. His team, he said, now has audio experts actively working to determine, if it's even technically possible at this point, whose voice is actually captured on that specific recording. As of that press conference, the question remained fully unresolved. Crump also said something genuinely worth repeating plainly here, because it represents a real and meaningful correction coming directly from a family's own legal team. Going forward, he said, his team will be far more careful to explicitly frame single witness claims as exactly that, claims. This is what one witness told us, rather than presenting them publicly as fully confirmed fact. If you're still seeing that original quote repeated online right now as though it's settled, established truth, that's worth remembering the next time you see it. Drop corrected in the comments if this is the first time you're actually hearing about that walk back, because the original clip and the original quote both still circulate constantly online, as though they were never revisited at all. Shepard's fuller account adds genuinely important context here that a lot of coverage is left out. On the question of the phone itself, he said there was nothing suspicious at all about how it ended up separated from Nolan, that everybody in the entire group left their phones sitting on the boat that day specifically to protect them from salt water and splashing, and that when he himself didn't get in the water, he put his own phone on the boat's dashboard alongside roughly 15 other phones belonging to other people in the wider group. He's also said plainly, and entirely on the record, that the actual reason Nolan stayed behind on the island was that he'd met a girl that day and genuinely wanted to keep talking with her, planning to catch a ride back to mainland later with a different boat from within that same wider group of friends. Nolan's parents, through their attorney, have responded to Shepard's account with far more grace than a lot of the internet discourse around this case has generally allowed itself. They've said publicly that they've never personally met him, and that they can't discount what he genuinely remembers, that they welcome every single honest account that comes forward, because what they actually want, before anything else in this world, is simply the truth about what happened to their son. There's a human detail worth sitting with here as well. Shepard has said he and others in his friend group have been receiving death threats ever since this case drew national attention. The exact same threats we discussed a moment ago, the ones the FBI is now actively working to address as a federal matter. Think honestly about what that actually means in practice. One of the very few people in this entire friend group willing to publicly correct a false claim about himself on camera under his own real name, at real personal cost, has been targeted specifically for doing that. If the practical price of correcting the public record turns out to be becoming a target yourself, that creates a genuinely dangerous incentive for anyone else who might have relevant information to simply stay silent instead of ever coming forward at all. Now, let's do something this case has genuinely needed for weeks now. A real minute-by-minute reconstruction of July 4th that doesn't rely on anyone's shaky memory of a chaotic holiday afternoon on a crowded beach. According to GPS records later obtained from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the boat carrying Nolan's group left at original dock at approximately 9:56 in the morning. It arrived at Horn Island at 11:14, a trip of a little over an hour across open water. Nothing about either one of those two specific timestamps raises a single question on its own. It's an entirely ordinary holiday morning departure to an island the same friend group had visited together before more than once, without a single incident. The last confirmed sighting of Nolan alive places him on Horn Island around 3 o'clock that afternoon. At around that exact same hour, according to dispatch audio later obtained through a public records request, someone aboard the group's boat placed an actual call for towing assistance. That recording is short, but it is genuinely one of the very few pieces of evidence in this entire case that exists completely independently of anyone's personal memory of that day. The boat's bilge pump, the mechanical system responsible for keeping water from accumulating inside the hull of the boat, had failed outright. The vessel was actively taking on water at the time of that call. This particular detail matters a great deal, and it's worth being genuinely precise about exactly why it matters so much. For nearly 2 full weeks, the entire public explanation for why the group left Horn Island when they did rested almost entirely on a single public source. A statement from Jackson County Chancery Court Judge Ashley Cole, whose own son Warren had been on that boat with Nolan that day. In a public post, she said the group left around 4:30 specifically because of this mechanical failure, that her son last personally saw Nolan around 3 o'clock, and that Nolan made his own independent decision to stay behind on the island, planning to catch a ride back to the mainland later with an entirely different group of friends he'd met there that same day. When that statement first went public, absolutely none of it could be independently verified by anyone outside that family. It was one mother's account, relayed secondhand to the public through social media. At the time, it deserved to be treated exactly that way and no other way, not dismissed outright as self-serving, and not treated as fully settled fact either. Some of it now has real, genuine, independent corroboration behind it. Dispatch audio, recorded in real time, hours before a single person on Earth knew Nolan would even go missing, confirms directly that the mechanical failure genuinely happened exactly as described. Nobody invents a fake boat emergency in advance of a disappearance that hasn't even occurred yet. That specific part of the account holds up completely under real scrutiny, and any honest accounting of this entire case has to say so plainly, without hedging. The GPS data tells a closely aligned story from a completely different angle entirely. According to the records themselves, the boat left Horn Island at 4:31 in the afternoon, nearly matching Judge Cole's public account almost exactly to the minute. It returned to its original departure dock at approximately 5:44. After apparently being towed for several miles at a noticeably reduced speed, before picking back up to a normal cruising speed less than an hour later on the way back. So here is what is actually genuinely confirmed at this point, and it's important to keep this clearly separated from what remains unconfirmed. Confirmed. The boat had a real, genuinely documented mechanical failure that specific afternoon. Confirmed. It left the island without Nolan aboard at approximately 4:31 in the afternoon. Confirmed. It returned to a mainland dock a little over an hour after that. Not confirmed. Exactly why Nolan wasn't aboard that boat when it left the island, whether he genuinely stayed behind entirely by his own choice, as the friends' families have consistently said, or whether the actual circumstances were more complicated than that simple version suggests. Not confirmed. What actually happened on that beach during the roughly 90 full minutes between the 3 o'clock distress call and the 4:31 departure? A window that, as of tonight, nobody on any single side of this case has publicly walked through in any real detail whatsoever. That 90-minute gap is, in a very real and practical sense, where this entire investigation still genuinely lives tonight. Drop the word gap in the comments below if this is the one specific detail you keep coming back to as well, because based on the messages we consistently get after every single one of these updates, you are very far from alone in that. When that boat finally pulled back into the dock, and Nolan clearly wasn't on it, nobody called Christine right away. Not, by every account currently available, because anyone involved was actively trying to hide anything from her, but because this exact same group had made this exact same trip together before, and a single evening without word from an 18-year-old on a holiday weekend simply wasn't yet, in anyone's mind at that specific moment, an outright crisis. That changed abruptly just after 11 o'clock that night, when Christine's phone finally rang. It wasn't Nolan calling. It was one of his friends instead. She has said publicly, more than once since, that this was the exact specific moment something inside her genuinely shifted, that a friend calling her directly at that particular hour of the night simply wasn't something that happened under any kind of ordinary circumstances. Around that same general hour, according to public reporting, a separate call was placed to the United States Coast Guard to report Nolan missing. The Coast Guard's response, as later reported publicly, was that the situation as it was described to them that night simply didn't meet the threshold required for immediate deployment. No cutter went out that night. No aircraft went up. It was the kind of call that, in practice, gets logged and closed within a matter of minutes. The kind that, in that specific moment, means very little to anyone involved. That decision, made in the very first hour anyone in an official capacity was told something was genuinely wrong, would later become one of the quieter, but ultimately more consequential, details in this entire timeline, because it directly meant that real, meaningful hours passed before any truly organized search response actually began in earnest. Christine spent the rest of that entire night trying to track her son down herself, largely on her own, before finally turning completely to law enforcement for help. When she finally did turn to them, she ran into a genuine, frustrating problem that nobody had warned her about in advance. Horn Island sits out in the open Mississippi Sound, and exactly which specific agency actually held jurisdiction over a missing person case originating out there wasn't immediately clear to anyone she initially spoke with on the phone that night. She's described a genuinely frustrating back and forth between different departments before the Jackson County Sheriff's Office finally agreed to open a formal missing person report. Later that same night, she and Elmore ended up meeting a deputy in a McDonald's parking lot of all places and laid out absolutely everything they knew at that point. By morning, Elmore genuinely couldn't wait around on official process any longer. He took his own personal boat out on July 5th and searched the waters near Horn Island entirely himself, a father physically combing open water on his own, while in parallel, an organized, official search effort was simultaneously standing up on shore. A command post was established at a local boat launch in Ocean Springs, and the search grew quickly from there to include the Jackson County Sheriff's Department, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the National Park Service for the Gulf Islands National Seashore, the United States Coast Guard, and the United Cajun Navy, a well-known volunteer search and rescue organization. The Cajun Navy's own incident commander has said publicly that the organization heard directly from Nolan's mother and moved extremely fast in response, deploying boats, drones, and personnel within just a matter of hours of hearing from her. 4 full days straight. That search covered both land and water around Horn Island with absolutely no result to show for it. Then, early on the morning of Monday, July 6th, at approximately 8:45 a.m., a National Park Service ranger spotted a body in the water along the island's northwestern shore. Sheriff John Ledbetter personally confirmed it matched the physical description investigators had been circulating publicly for Nolan Wells. The search for Nolan Wells as a living person was tragically over. The search for what actually happened to him out on that island was only just beginning in earnest. I want to stop here for a second, because this is usually the exact point in one of these updates where people quietly bounce off to the next video without ever clicking subscribe. And I genuinely rather ask you directly than lose you quietly without saying anything. We put real hours into pulling apart GPS records, dispatch audio, and public statements from each other, so that you personally don't have to sort through hours of raw footage and court filings yourself just to get the real picture. If that's actually useful to you as a viewer, the only thing that keeps this channel able to keep doing exactly that is people actually joining as subscribers instead of just watching once and quietly moving on with their night. Right now, our numbers show a lot more of you watching these videos than actually following the channel, and we genuinely love to close that specific gap. So if you haven't already done it, go ahead right now and subscribe, and turn that notification bell on too, so you don't miss whatever eventually comes out of this grand jury process down the road. Thank you sincerely for sticking with us this far into tonight's update. Let's keep going. At the center of nearly every single unanswered question in this entire case sits one specific piece of pending evidence: the cause and manner of Nolan's death, which has not yet been officially confirmed by either of the two separate medical processes currently underway. The state autopsy was carried out on July 7th at the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office. Investigators have said publicly that there is currently no indication of drug or alcohol involvement, though officials themselves have been genuinely clear that the specific reading remains preliminary at this stage. A full, official cause and manner of death has not been released yet, because the medical examiner's office is still waiting on toxicology results that officials themselves have openly said could take a couple of weeks or considerably longer, entirely depending on current lab capacity and case backlog. Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lynn told CNN directly on the record that the swimsuit recovered on the body matched the exact one Nolan had been photographed wearing earlier that same day, before he went missing. There is genuinely no dispute anywhere on that specific point. It's so far the single fact in this entire timeline that both the grieving family and the official investigation agree on completely, without a single shred of qualification attached. What they do not agree on is what that particular fact actually means for how he ultimately ended up in the water in the first place. Ben Crump has said publicly more than once now that Nolan was a genuine, dedicated athlete in peak physical condition, a genuinely strong swimmer, and that at a crowded holiday beach with literally hundreds of people scattered along it that afternoon, it simply isn't the kind of place a strong swimmer typically just disappears from completely unnoticed by anyone. Coroner Lynn has offered a meaningfully different frame on the exact same set of facts, telling CNN directly that the current running along that specific end of Horn Island runs genuinely strong, and that this exact stretch of the Barrier Islands has a real, well-documented history of drownings over the years, entirely independent of the specific case. A representative of the United Cajun Navy has occupied a position sitting somewhere carefully between both of those two accounts, saying publicly that the rip current in that specific area on July 4th was strong enough that even the strongest, most experienced swimmers can genuinely struggle to break free of it once caught, while in that same breath wondering aloud how, with that many people scattered across that same beach that same day, not one single person reportedly noticed anybody in visible distress in the water. Neither man is necessarily wrong about what he's each describing from his own vantage point. The independent autopsy, performed in Washington, D.C., and funded in part by Colin Kaepernick, has also not been made public at any point, even though Crump has said at multiple separate points that he genuinely expected those specific findings to arrive soon. As of the most recent press conference on record, the family's own attorneys confirmed directly that they're still waiting, that the independent doctors, in Crump's own words, ain't got their autopsy back either. Two completely separate autopsies, two entirely separate labs, sitting roughly 1,000 miles apart from each other. And as of tonight, neither single one of them has given this family, or the broader watching public, a confirmed, final answer of any kind. Legal analysts who discuss this case publicly have noted that if there turns out to be a stark, meaningful difference between what the state's official examination ultimately concludes and what the independent examination separately shows, that specific divergence itself will instantly become one of the more significant developments in this entire case, regardless of which specific direction it ultimately points in. And if the two examinations align closely instead, that alignment would matter just as much in its own way, because it would remove one of the central sources of ongoing distrust that's been driving the family's independent investigation in the first place. Until either one of these two reports is actually finally released to public, everything else currently swirling around this case, every theory, every timeline reconstruction, every single piece of digital evidence, is, in a very real and literal sense, sitting entirely on top of an incomplete medical record, separate entirely from the disputed video. There's the actual physical phone itself, and everything that happened to it after Nolan went missing that night. This particular detail doesn't depend at all on anyone's shaky memory of a chaotic holiday afternoon on a crowded beach. When Nolan was formally reported missing, his phone genuinely wasn't with him. It surfaced instead in the possession of one of his own friends. Christine has said publicly that she and her sister tracked the device down entirely themselves, using a family location-sharing app, and located it sitting at a friend's residence, rather than ever being handed it directly by anyone involved. When she and her sister finally accessed the phone themselves, both of Nolan's separate Snapchat accounts were found to be completely empty. No saved photos anywhere. No saved videos anywhere. Even though, by her own account, Nolan reliably documented gatherings exactly like this one every single time, and even though that specific kind of content should typically still have remained retrievable within the app's normal 24-hour rolling window, some text messages appeared to be missing from the device as well, on top of everything else. None of that, taken entirely on its own, actually proves deliberate tampering by anyone specific. People clear out their own phones for all kinds of completely ordinary reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with any crime whatsoever. But it's genuinely worth understanding what deletion on a modern smartphone actually technically means before jumping to any firm conclusion about it either way. Either way, deleted data is not automatically permanently unrecoverable in every case. Forensic extraction can often still retrieve real information off a device long after someone genuinely believes it's completely gone for good, and separately, carrier-side records also exist entirely independently of whatever does or doesn't survive on the physical device itself. As of the most recent public statement available, Sheriff Ledbetter's office has said directly that it never had actual physical possession of the phone at any point, and formally requested it for proper forensic extraction, while the family's own private investigators examined the device first on their own before that request was made. Following the family's formal meeting with the district attorney's office, both sides ultimately agreed to something genuinely significant: a mutual, fully simultaneous inspection, meaning the family's own forensic experts and law enforcement's own experts will examine the device together at the exact same time, seeing the exact same data pulled the exact same way, specifically so that neither side can later dispute publicly how the other side's process was actually handled. That specific arrangement matters far more than it might first appear on the surface. In cases where there's already a genuine trust deficit between the grieving family and local investigators, a joint, simultaneous digital examination effectively eliminates most of the disputes that would otherwise inevitably follow, over chain of custody, over whether anything was subtly altered along the way, over whose forensic findings ultimately deserve more weight in the end. Everybody watching the exact same screen at the exact same time removes almost all of that lingering uncertainty in one clean move. Legal analysts who discussed this case publicly have called it a genuinely unusual arrangement, one that likely wouldn't have happened at all without sustained public pressure and real legal pressure building over time. Quick pause here, because we're about to walk through the entire grand jury process in real detail, and I genuinely want to make sure everyone watching actually sees it clearly. If you made it this deep into a genuinely long, detailed breakdown of a single case, you clearly care about getting the story right, and that's exactly the kind of viewer this channel is actually built for from the ground up. Here's the honest, direct ask. Our subscriber count is currently trailing well behind our view count, which means a real number of people watching this exact sentence right now haven't actually joined the channel yet. If that happens to be you, take 3 seconds right now and go fix that. Hit subscribe. And if you want the full experience, tap the bell too, so the next confirmed update on this case doesn't quietly slip past you in your feed the way so many important updates do online. We genuinely appreciate every single one of you who takes that step. All right. Let's talk about what a grand jury referral in this specific case actually means in practice, because there's a huge amount of confusion about it circulating online right now. On the morning of Wednesday, July 15th, Christine and Elmore Wansley sat down directly with Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath and members of her own office for the very first time since their son's body had been recovered days earlier. Ben Crump was there with them, along with attorney Eric Hertz, who is currently leading the family's independent investigative effort, and attorney Lisa Park as well. Afterward, the legal team confirmed 2 genuinely concrete developments to reporters. First, once the Jackson County Sheriff's Office finishes its own investigation, the case will formally be turned over to a grand jury. Second, both sides had agreed to that mutual, simultaneous inspection of Nolan's phone we just walked through in detail. It's genuinely worth being precise here, because this is exactly the kind of announcement that gets distorted within hours online by people rushing to be first with a reaction. A grand jury referral for an unnatural or suspicious death is actually standard, ordinary procedure in Jackson County. It does not, on its own, mean that criminal charges are automatically coming down the line. The district attorney's office has stated directly on the record that authorities have not indicated at this current stage that this is being formally treated as a criminal investigation. A grand jury is simply a panel of ordinary citizens, typically somewhere between 15 and 25 people in this specific jurisdiction, who review whatever evidence prosecutors ultimately choose to present to them, and then decide collectively whether there's enough there to support formally moving forward with charges. It is not a trial in any sense. There's no defense presentation at all, in the way you typically see play out in an actual courtroom. It's simply prosecutors presenting evidence, and a panel of citizens deciding on their own whether that specific evidence supports an indictment. That grand jury referral hasn't actually been received as unambiguous good news by everyone closely following this case. Former Mississippi Judge Carlos Moore has publicly raised his own genuine concerns about District Attorney Myers McElrath specifically, pointing directly to what he describes as her office's own history in a previous, entirely unrelated case involving a fatal police shooting, where he says overwhelming evidence still somehow failed to produce a single indictment. He's argued publicly that a grand jury referral alone shouldn't automatically be mistaken for genuine progress, and has said he personally intends to keep watching this specific case closely to make sure it doesn't quietly stall out the exact same way he believes that earlier case ultimately did. A different attorney entirely, Tyler Bailey, has offered considerably more measured read on the exact same development, explaining publicly that a grand jury referral is actually standard, routine procedure in this specific county for any death considered unnatural or suspicious in nature, not, on its own, proof that foul play has been formally confirmed or even strongly suspected by investigators. Both of these two perspectives are genuinely worth holding at the same time. More skepticism comes from real, specific, documented history with this particular prosecutor's office. Bailey's explanation comes instead from how these kinds of referrals typically function as a simple matter of ordinary process across the board. This can genuinely be standard procedure, and the specific DA's own track record can still absolutely deserve close, continued public attention going forward. The real test here isn't the referral itself. It's what actually ends up happening once a grand jury actually receives whatever evidence this investigation ultimately produces at the end of it all. Bailey has also said, discussing this case publicly on record, that if the specific matter does eventually go before a grand jury, the actual range of potential charges on the table is genuinely broad, and doesn't necessarily point to a homicide charge specifically at all. It could realistically involve anything touching on obstruction of justice, accessory after the fact, or various other offenses tied directly to how the immediate aftermath of that day was actually handled by people involved, not necessarily direct proof of who specifically caused the death, if anyone actually did in a criminal sense. On the specific, narrower question of homicide-related charges, he said this remains genuinely difficult to properly assess from the outside because the actual cause of death itself has not yet been officially determined by anyone. Whether physical evidence ultimately supports blunt force trauma, whether someone was genuinely in the water under some form of coercion versus entirely voluntarily, or whether this was simply an ordinary, tragic drowning, is fundamentally a forensic question that depends entirely on what the two pending autopsies ultimately show, not on witness testimony alone, however compelling that testimony might sound. Attorney Hertz added genuinely meaningful detail of his own at that same press conference. He said there are still a great many unanswered questions remaining, and that because of confidentiality protections that legally apply even to victims' families under Mississippi law, the family did not actually receive every single answer they'd hoped for coming out of that meeting, a genuine limitation of the overall legal process itself. He was careful to note publicly, rather than clear evidence of any specific wrongdoing on anyone's part. He also disclosed something that gives a real, tangible sense of scale for just how much public attention this case has genuinely generated nationwide. His team, he said, is currently fielding somewhere between 50 and 100 calls a day from people who say they were personally on Horn Island that specific day, or who know someone personally who was there. There was also a specific, entirely checkable procedural grievance raised directly at that meeting. Under Mississippi law, according to Hertz, crime victims, a category which under most state victims' rights statutes extends legally to immediate family members in a death case, are entitled by law to receive a formal incident report and certain baseline case information within a specific window of time, which Hertz cited publicly as 72 hours from the incident. That specific window had long since passed by the actual time of this meeting, and the family still had not received that report from anyone. This particular point is genuinely worth separating out entirely from every other claim swirling around this case, because it isn't a matter of competing witness accounts at all. It's a plain, verifiable statement about a specific legal entitlement, and whether or not it was actually met on time by the responsible agency. Christine added one more detail worth including here in full, because it speaks directly to how this family has experienced the official side of this entire investigation. She said the last time anyone from the sheriff's department had actually personally communicated with the family before this specific meeting was the previous Tuesday, and that even that particular contact wasn't initiated by the sheriff's office itself. She was the one who sent a text message that day, personally asking for any kind of update on her own son's death investigation. Following this meeting with the DA, the district attorney's office formally agreed to take over as the family's primary point of contact going forward, through a dedicated victim advocate assigned specifically to their case. Christine has said publicly that she genuinely appreciated the office openly acknowledging responsibility for that particular communication gap, though it's worth noting plainly that the specific acknowledgement and the actual plan to fix it came only after the family's own legal team raised the issue directly and forcefully in that meeting, not proactively from law enforcement itself beforehand, on its own initiative. None of this tells us, on its own, exactly what will actually happen next in this case. It's included here in this much detail because understanding the actual legal mechanics at play, rather than simply treating the phrase grand jury as some kind of automatic synonym for murder charges are definitely coming, is genuinely part of covering the specific case honestly and responsibly. It's worth stepping back for a moment here and talking honestly about why this particular case has felt, to so many people following it closely, like it's moving unbearably slowly, even though, when you actually lay the full timeline out, a genuinely significant amount has happened in a relatively short window of time. Cases involving open water, a remote location with no cameras and no cell coverage, and a group of witnesses who are still teenagers or barely out of their teens, are, almost across the board, some of the hardest kinds of cases for investigators to move quickly on, regardless of where in the country they happen. There's no security footage from a store entrance to pull. There's no doorbell camera catching a car pulling up at a specific time. There's only human memory, which is inherently unreliable under stress. Physical evidence that has to survive both salt water and the passage of time, and a small number of digital records that have to be requested, obtained, and then carefully cross-referenced against each other before anyone can say anything with real confidence. That's not an excuse for every single gap in this investigation. The 72-hour incident report window that passed without the family receiving anything is a real documented failure, regardless of how understaffed or overwhelmed the small county sheriff's office might genuinely be. But it is useful context for understanding why a case like this one can look, from the outside, like it's crawling along, while investigators on the inside are actually working through a genuinely complex set of overlapping processes at the same time. There's the sheriff's department's own core investigation. There's the district attorney's office, now coordinating directly and formally with the family, working toward that grand jury referral. There's a family's own independent investigation, staffed with former law enforcement and former federal agents, fielding dozens of calls a day. There's the state's autopsy. There's a separate independent autopsy. And now there's a coordinated joint review of Nolan's phone involving both sides simultaneously. Each one of those processes has its own separate timeline, its own set of experts, and its own internal standard for what actually counts as confirmed. Keeping all of them straight in your head and not assuming that a development in one automatically means something significant for the others is genuinely part of what makes this particular case so difficult to follow accurately from a distance. It's also worth naming something honestly about the environment this case is unfolding inside of. A case like this one, involving a young man, a remote island, a group of friends, and a set of contested final hours, would have generated real local attention in almost any era. What's different now is the speed and the scale at which every single detail, confirmed or not, travels. 20 years ago, a viral clip claiming to capture someone's final words simply couldn't exist in the way it does today, spreading to millions of screens within hours, stripped of context, before a single investigator has even had the chance to sit down and review it properly. That's not a criticism of anyone specifically. It's simply the water this entire case is swimming in, an understanding that helps explain why corrections, walkbacks, and careful, slow-moving official statements feel, at times, like they're arriving almost too late to matter, even when they're genuinely the most important updates of the entire week. Before we move into the final stretch of tonight's update, one more quick ask, and then I promise we'll get straight back into it. If you watched this entire breakdown from the very beginning, you already know we're not the channel that's going to feed you a dramatic, unverified headline just to get reaction out of you in the first 30 seconds. That approach takes real time to actually produce. And the honest truth is that it only keeps working if enough of you decide to stick around for the next one. So here's the ask one more time, worded a little differently than before. If you've gotten real value out of tonight's update, make it official. Hit that subscribe button right now. Before you forget, and let us know in the comments which specific unresolved detail from tonight's ledger you personally think gets answered first, the autopsy, the phone, or the 90-minute gap. Thank you for genuinely being here for this one. Let's finish this out properly. Before we close out tonight, it's worth addressing something directly, because it has genuinely become its own separate problem embedded inside this story, entirely apart from the underlying facts of Nolan's actual death. Multiple established news outlets have reported openly on just how much false information has rushed in to fill the silence, while both autopsies remain officially pending. A pool party photograph that spread rapidly across social media, claiming to show Nolan alive sometime after July 4th, was independently investigated by reporters and traced through the photo's own metadata back to June 27th, a full 8 days before the 4th of July. And well before Nolan had ever even stepped onto that boat in the first place. Tristan Shepard personally confirmed the actual date and the people shown in that specific photo directly, entirely separate from the metadata evidence itself, which only reinforced the same conclusion from a completely different angle. Crump himself has openly acknowledged that his own team reposted that specific image without first authenticating it, specifically in order to ask the wider public whether anyone recognized it, not as confirmed evidence of anything. And he said publicly that his team's social media accounts consistently label reposts explicitly as reposts, precisely for this exact reason. The viral video and the disputed quote we covered earlier in tonight's update went through a strikingly similar arc from start to finish. An unverified claim, treated almost instantly as fully settled fact within mere hours of first appearing, followed weeks later by a direct, on-the-record correction from the very same attorney who had originally shared it with the public in the first place. If you happen to see a claim circulating right now stating that either one of the two pending autopsy results are already out, especially one describing some specific, dramatic new finding in vivid detail, treat that particular claim with real, genuine skepticism until it's actually confirmed by a named, checkable source. That gap between an emotionally invested, anxious public and a slow, deliberately careful medical and legal process is precisely where fabricated claims tend to spread the absolute fastest. And this specific case has already demonstrated that exact pattern more than once over the past few weeks. Every single rumor that later turns out to be false doesn't just waste everyone's attention in the moment it spreads. It actively makes the real findings, whenever they finally do arrive, that much harder for everyone involved, the general public, the grieving family, and the investigators themselves, to actually trust once they're finally released. There's one more thing worth saying plainly here, because it applies to how all of us, including this channel, engage with a case like this one. The instinct to fill a gap in the timeline with the most dramatic possible explanation is powerful, and it's not unique to any one platform or any one creator. It happens in comment sections. It happens in group chats. It happens on the news. The discipline this case actually requires is the boring, unglamorous kind, waiting for a lab result instead of predicting one, quoting a witness as a witness instead of upgrading their account to fact, and being willing to say out loud that we simply don't know yet. That discipline doesn't generate the same kind of engagement that a bold, confident claim does. but it's the only version of this story that will still hold up once the actual answers finally arrive. Here, then, is a complete, honest ledger, exactly as it stands tonight. Confirmed. The boat's full documented movement from a 9:56 a.m. departure to an 11:14 a.m. arrival at Horn Island. A 3 o'clock distress call, independently corroborating a genuine mechanical failure aboard the boat. A 4:31 p.m. departure from the island that closely matches the earliest public account of that afternoon, almost to the minute. A 5:44 p.m. return to the original dock. Formal identification of Nolan's body through dental records. A case now formally headed toward eventual presentation before a grand jury once the sheriff's office concludes its own investigation. A joint, simultaneous forensic inspection of Nolan's phone, formally agreed to by both the family's own investigators and law enforcement together. On-the-record cooperation with investigators from several individuals directly connected to the boat and the day's events. The FBI has confirmed limited role supporting Jackson County and specifically addressing interstate threats made against people connected to this case. Katie's direct, in-person account to Christine, an honest assumption based on a real conversation, not a first-hand claim about what physically happened afterward. A confirmed procedural gap in which the family did not receive their legally entitled incident report within the required window of time. Unresolved. Exactly why Nolan wasn't aboard the boat when it left the island, whether entirely by his own personal choice, as one consistent account holds, or under circumstances that remain genuinely more complicated than that. What actually happened during the roughly 90-minute window between the last confirmed sighting of Nolan and the boat's eventual departure from the island, whose voice is actually captured on the widely circulated video, still currently under active review by audio experts. What content, if any, was actually deleted from Nolan's phone, and by whom specifically, pending the outcome of the joint forensic examination, what both the state and the independent autopsies will ultimately conclude about the official cause and manner of death. The specific content of the threats the FBI has confirmed occurred, but has not detailed publicly, and exactly who received them. No cause of death has been officially confirmed as of this recording. No individual has been formally named a suspect by any agency. No charges have been filed against anyone at all in connection with Nolan Wells' death. His parents are still, tonight, waking up every single morning to the exact same question they've been asking themselves since the night his friends first came home without him. Not as an accusation aimed squarely at any one specific person, but as a plain, unbearable question that any parent standing in their exact position would ask of the world. What happened to my son? The toxicology results are still pending. The independent autopsy findings have not been released to anyone. The formal grand jury process has not yet even begun in earnest. When any of those specific things actually change, not before, and not based on whatever happens to spread the fastest online in the meantime, that is when this case will genuinely move forward in a meaningful way. We'll bring you that exact update the moment there's something real, sourced, and fully confirmed to report to you. Not a single moment before that. If tonight's breakdown gave you a genuinely clearer picture of where this case actually stands and you had walking in, that's exactly what we set out to do from the very first sentence. And it means a great deal to us that you stayed with us through every single part of it tonight. Here's the very last thing I'll ask of you, and then I'll let you go for the night. We can see clearly in the numbers that far more of you watch these updates than are actually subscribed to this channel right now. If tonight's video earned in your eyes, go ahead and close that gap for us. Hit subscribe, ring that notification bell, and you'll be here the exact second the autopsy results finally land. The exact second that joint phone inspection actually happens, and the exact second a grand jury eventually makes any kind of real decision on this case. Thank you, genuinely and sincerely, for being here with us for this one, all the way to the end. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old. He is remembered by his teammates as a guy who celebrated other people's wins just as loudly as he celebrated his own, by his teachers as the kid who made absolutely sure nobody in the room ever felt overlooked or left out, and by his own parents tonight as a light they're still trying one impossibly hard day at a time to find a way to talk about in the past tense. We'll see you in the next update.